While researching for my Hutterite documentary, I kept coming across these stories of the Hutterites being pillaged, killed, and being dragged off to be sold as slaves by the Ottoman Empire. But there's one story in particular that was especially horrific, but also one which perfectly captures the love, relentlessness, and vitality of the Hutterites. And I will be basing this video predominantly on the brilliant Anabaptist scholar Robert Friedman's essay called Adventures of an Anabaptist in Turkey from 1607 to 1610. But let's start with some background first. By 1600, the Ottoman Empire extended from modern-day Algeria all the way to Yemen, Iraq, and Iran. And they were pushing ever more northward into Europe, much of which they had already conquered. Robert Friedman writes, "Today one can scarcely realize the fear and horror which the Europe of the 16th century felt at the sound of the word Turk. It made everybody shiver and tremble. From the beginning of the century, the Turks had advanced in ever-renewed waves from the Balkans through Hungary toward the west, killing, pillaging, burning whatever they came across. They pushed forward toward Austria and came as far as the Tyrol. During this period, the Ottomans took huge amounts of slaves, including women and young children, that were brought back and sold in public markets. Austria was now the eastern frontier and acted as Europe's last line of defense against the invading Ottomans. In 1593, the Long Turkish War broke out between the Holy Roman Empire and the Ottoman Empire, lasting until 1606. It was here in this frontier area in Southern Moravia where the Hutterites were famously practicing their community of goods and non-resistance in peace. However, the Long Turkish War turned this area into a war zone. The European peasants in this area, including the Hutterites, suffered atrocities from this war. The Turks burned down all the peasants' homes, slaughtered the men, and dragged the women and young children into captivity, where they were to be brought back to the Ottoman Empire and sold into slavery. The worst of the Hutterite encounters with the invading Ottomans occurred in June 1605, which is what this video will cover in depth. The Ottoman soldiers came across the Hutterites and did as much damage as they possibly could. They pillaged and burned down at least 16 Moravian Hutterite colonies, murdered countless numbers of men, and dragged away all the women and girls from several colonies into captivity. In total, the Turks captured 240 Hutterites, all of whom they brought back to Turkey to be sold as slaves to wealthy sultans, all throughout the Ottoman Empire. As you can imagine, this event was an absolute catastrophe for the surviving Hutterites in Moravia. The pillaging, thieving, burning down of colonies financially destroyed the Hutterites, not to mention how demoralizing and traumatic it must have been to have had all your sisters, mothers, and daughters from a bunch of colonies all taken from you, with the likelihood of never seeing them again. It's an unspeakable crime. And what's worse, the Hutterites were left completely powerless to do anything about their enslaved sisters. Because they were left financially ruined, they were under constant persecution from the raging wars all around them, and the Catholic Jesuits were infiltrating the Hutterite colonies as well. However, one Hutterite brother did manage to step up and attempt to rescue the women and children who had been dragged away by the soldiers, and this man's name was Salomon Böger, and he is the hero in this incredible untold story. At the end of this video, I'll share exactly how many Hutterites Solomon saved, and also what ended up happening to the rest. But first, we must detail Solomon's incredible rescue missions. Solomon was a Hutterite brother and a miller by trade, and in 1605, his wife and child were two of those who had been dragged away from the colonies by the Turkish soldiers. Solomon could not sit idly by and passively accept what had happened to his wife, child, and the rest of the sisters. Even though the Hutterite colonies in southern Moravia were in complete ruins, Solomon's conscience pushed him to do whatever was necessary to get back his family and as many Hutterite sisters as he could. Now, to understand this story, you need to understand that the Hutterites are a very communal people. They have a shared community of goods that they all hold in common, and they make decisions together, collectively, where private, individual actions are not allowed until the entire community has expressed its collective support. This is why Salomon Böger had to wait for the consent of the whole Hutterian Brotherhood before he could go to Turkey and attempt to rescue the captured Hutterite sisters and get their release. Unfortunately, while Solomon waited for the consent of the Brotherhood to approve his plans, precious time was lost. On the 11th of November, 1606, 17 months after the horrible attack on the Hutterites, the bloody Long Turkish War ended when Austria signed the formal peace treaty with the Ottoman Empire. This peace treaty brought huge relief to all of Europe. According to this treaty, Turkey was ready to keep peace in the West if Emperor Rudolf II would present a gift of 200,000 gold coins to the Ottoman Sultan. This treaty ushered in a period of peace where Solomon could now go into Turkey and try to find the enslaved Hutterites relatively safely. Also during this time, the Hutterian Brotherhood had approved of Solomon's plans. Robert Friedman writes, "The peace was concluded on November 11th, 1606, and already in December, 18 months after the disastrous events in Moravia, Solomon set out for the first time toward the east, without knowledge of the country or its language, and presumably equipped with nothing but the scantiest allowance." Solomon's adventures are known to us because luckily he wrote 24 letters back to the Moravian Hutterites during his adventures between the years of 1607 to 1610, where he details his adventures and updates the Hutterites on the progress that he is making towards searching for the captured Hutterite sisters. Although Solomon's letters aren't in English, Robert Friedman wrote a brief 15-page essay summarizing Solomon's letters, which is what I'll be going off of. Friedman describes Solomon's letters as being so full of moral greatness, human warmth, and liveliness that one cannot read them but with the greatest sympathy. Salomon Böger began his journey on December of 1606, making his way towards Vienna, the capital of Austria, which was roughly 100 kilometers away from his home colony in Southern Moravia. He went to Austria with the intention of getting letters of recommendation. Unfortunately, very few businessmen in Vienna traded with those in the Ottoman-controlled Hungary because of the instability from wars, lack of trust, and lack of credit. From Vienna, Solomon traveled down the Danube River to the city of Comoron, which was one of the few Hungarian forts that had not been conquered by the Ottomans. Here, Solomon settled all the business necessary for him to now enter the Ottoman territories, and from here he moved on to Budapest, which was also the residence of the Turkish viceroy of Hungary named Ali Pasha, one of the most powerful Turks in the Ottoman Empire. Once in the Ottoman-controlled city of Budapest, Friedman writes that Solomon applied to two Austrian civil commissioners by the name of Philip and Lucas. These two men's jobs would have been to take care of the interests of Western prisoners and, if possible, to facilitate the rescuing. So Solomon had reached out to these Austrians, hoping that they could help him in his rescue mission as well. It comes across that these two men's jobs of rescuing slaves in the Ottoman Empire was made very difficult because of the tough negotiations with the crafty Ali Pasha. But luckily for Solomon, these two Austrian commissioners were both staunch Christians and will turn out to be critical in Solomon's search for the enslaved Hutterite sisters. These two men do end up forming connections with Solomon and will provide Solomon with valuable help later on, which will lead to some Hutterites being saved. But after a 3-month stay in Budapest, Solomon returned to Moravia, but only for a short while to report back to the elders and receive counsel. He writes that he could not find any rest back in Moravia and only stayed there for 1 month until he headed back to Budapest for his second journey. But before we dive into Solomon's second journey, it's important to explain a few things about the process of rescuing slaves in the Ottoman Empire. First of all, if you want to rescue a person from slavery who is enslaved or being sold in the Ottoman Empire, you first have to find them, and this is no easy task. This meant that you usually had to hire a Turk to investigate the slave's location, which costed regular payments of 50 to 70 gold coins, until the slave was discovered. And if you were lucky enough to find the location of the slave that you wished to free, the price that you had to pay was often so large that it was unaffordable. Another problem that Solomon had to overcome was the fact that the Turks would keep the women that they were selling in the markets completely concealed and behind closed doors, which made Solomon's search all the more difficult. But despite all of these difficulties, when you read Friedman's summary of Solomon's 24 letters, you get an overwhelming sense of how full of love, charity, and vitality that was in this Hutterite. These two Austrian commissioners that Solomon had met early on were genuinely interested in assisting Solomon's rescue mission, and they did indeed manage to track down and secure a number of Hutterite sisters in the slave trade. Solomon would then have to write a letter to the Hutterite Brotherhood in Moravia asking for the necessary money, clothes, and other valuable goods to be used as a ransom payment, in order to receive the Hutterite sisters who the two Austrian commissioners had guaranteed for them. Unfortunately, Friedman writes that the brethren were often not able to satisfy Solomon's demands, or could do so but extremely slowly and only at a reduced scale. But throughout all of Solomon's travels, he would frequently come across female prisoners being sold in the Turkish slave market, and be filled with so much sadness and pain at how the Ottoman slave masters treated the female prisoners, that even though they were not Hutterites, Solomon would still request funds from the Moravian Hutterites to buy these non-Hutterite women and free them from the Turkish slave trade, which I think is pretty cool. In several letters, Solomon wrote to the Brotherhood in Moravia, where he actually apologizes for spending funds to free non-Hutterite women and promises not to do it again. But then he comes across more female prisoners who are not Hutterites and breaks this promise, begging them for more funds to free these non-Hutterite women. After a month at home in Moravia, Solomon continued his mission because he could not rest. He stayed in Budapest for 3.5 months. Friedman says that Solomon's letters home are moving records revealing a picture of endless suffering. Women were seduced by Turks, but after the children were born, they were abandoned, and the women were compelled to ride away on horseback with their captors. Solomon often writes about women who became insane, about 2 boys dying in a rotten prison, and we even hear of one conversion to the faith of Islam, which would bar any possible return of the enslaved victim back to the West. But Solomon also writes about his relentless activity, where he found sisters and comforted them as well as he could. Solomon wrote in a letter to a Hutterite elder, "It's a sad business, but you must not be concerned about me, for I have taken up the burden myself, and I do not want to save my energy." Solomon returned to Moravia for a second time in the summer of 1607, with the hopes of raising more money from the Hutterian Brotherhood. Solomon had now totally committed his life to rescuing the Hutterite women who were still oppressed in slavery. He wrote, "I would like to be with the congregation with a contented heart, and I am yearning for an unconcerned and harmonious conclusion of my life." But Solomon knew that without his beloved wife, he could have no more restful or easy hours. Solomon wrote that it was not the willfulness that pushed him in his search, but it was the anxiety and apprehension that pushed him. There was no other aim in his life other than this one, to continue his self-appointed relief project and bring back the Hutterite girls from the Turkish slave trade. Solomon's third journey lasted for 8 months, much longer than the first 2. He was away from home from August 1607 to April 1608. On this mission, Solomon wrote he would no longer trust any assistance from the deceitful Turks, but instead look after things by himself. Salomon made his way to Belgrade, in modern-day Serbia, which marked his first extended search beyond the Hungarian territory. However, this was not without hardship and pitfalls. For example, Salomon says that at this time, there were no inns that he could stay at, but only so-called caravanseries, which are described as gloomy horse stables with beds on top of rocks, and that were frequented by murderous bandits and robbers. Unfortunately, nothing came of this third journey, and he returned from Serbia back to Moravia. After a quick stay to recoup, Salomon headed up the Daine River back to the Comoron fort, the same fort that he had been to on his first journey. Here, he was surprised with some very exciting news. The imperial embassy carrying the gold to the Ottoman Sultan, laid out in the peace treaty, was now en route to Constantinople, 15 months after the signing of the peace treaty. And just by chance, in the entourage traveling alongside the ambassador was a Hutterian brother named Balthasar Gawler, whom Salomon knew very well. Balthasar was a physician of the ambassador, who was escorting the gold to the Sultan. Balthasar invited Salomon to join the entourage and to travel with them to Turkey, an invitation that Salomon eagerly accepted. The embassy had left Vienna in May 1608 and traveled up the Danube River to the Comoron fort, where they were joined by Salomon on June 21st. From here, they made their way to the Sublime Porte in Constantinople. This entourage would provide Salomon with all the necessary safety while in Turkey, where he could now search for the Hutterian sisters in places farther eastward than he had previously gone. After the ambassador accepted Salomon into the entourage, he gave him a job as the butler to the traveling officials. In his letters, Salomon writes that at each of the entourage's stopping points, he would demand to temporarily leave the group in search of the Hutterian sisters. But this often would cause problems, as he was not allowed to neglect his duties as the butler. Soon, the Austrian entourage arrived at their destination in Sublime Porte in Constantinople, where they delivered the 150,000 gold ducat coins, 50,000 less than they had promised in the peace treaty. Now you may ask yourself, why are the Austrians not delivering the full amount that they had agreed to in the peace treaty? Well, it was because there were still tons and tons of slaves and prisoners that the Ottoman Empire had not released back to the West. While in Constantinople, Salomon was tipped off by someone who informed him that there were women being held captive just beyond Asia Minor. Hearing this, Salomon immediately set off on a 3-day journey over the sea to, quote, to an old city by the name of Nicaea, where the big council had taken place, the first one. Of course, Salomon here is referring to the Council of Nicaea. Unfortunately, this attempt also went nowhere, and Salomon returned to the convoy in Constantinople empty-handed, once again. The entourage left Constantinople in November 1608 and arrived in Budapest in January of 1609. Salomon writes that this trip had been in vain because of the limited opportunities he had been given to search for the Hutterian girls. Salomon did not write much about Constantinople, other than how a disease raged through the people there, and how many of them were dying. Salomon had now been away from home for 2 years, without any money nor comfort, except for the inner fire in him, burning with devotion to his wife and sadness for the prisoners, which pushed Salomon to relentlessly continue his mission. He did not return to Moravia, but instead remained in Budapest, planning another big expedition into Serbia to pursue some traces of the sisters that he thought he had discovered. These traces of the sisters put Salomon on the road for another 2 months. Salomon wrote that he was now going to search for the girls alone, as he no longer trusted the help from the mendacious, deceitful Turks, as he wrote. In previous trips, Salomon had been accompanied by an Italian doctor, and then by the ambassador's entourage. But now, Salomon was traveling down the Danube River, all alone and completely terrified for his life. He faced great hardships in this journey, and he had no money. In a letter regarding this trip, Solomon wrote that at one point he had not eaten warm soup for 8 days. He also mentioned that he had acquired a very bad eye disease which had disabled his writing. But in the middle of all of these struggling months, one kind-hearted Turk invited Solomon to stay in his home, which was a nice change from how he usually slept, which was outside in the open air. With this Turk, Solomon saw and heard a great deal about the bad situation that the general population of Turkey was in. The Turk described to Solomon that most of them had very little money, as the Sultan virtually squeezed the last penny out of all of them for his war purposes. When Solomon traveled to Belgrade, he was looked upon as a spy. Nobody understood his purposes and motives, and kind people warned him of the great danger that he was in. Although Solomon was very lucky coming out of Serbia unharmed, he was also returning empty-handed. Here, Solomon prepared for a new journey, but in a completely new geographical area. Solomon was very nervous about this expedition, and thought that it may be his most dangerous one yet. He now planned to journey north in an area controlled by the Haiduks, a group of people who seemed to be even more fierce than the Turks. The Haiduks had apparently once blackmailed the Turkish leader, Ali Pasha, into waging new wars for the sole sake of being able to pillage more villages. But Solomon knew from multiple credible sources that there were several sisters in the city of Eglar, near the Transylvanian border, who could be delivered by good fortune. The hard part? No businessman or trader dared to go there because of the high likelihood of being robbed, assaulted, and murdered on your way to these Hajduk territories. Solomon debated amongst himself because of how frightened the rumors made him. Solomon's biggest fear of this journey was not the journey to the town, or even about his own safety, but the safety of the sisters while accompanying them back to Moravia, as he believed that there was a strong chance that they could be murdered or recaptured on the journey home. Nevertheless, Solomon wrote a letter to the Brotherhood in Moravia, bidding farewell and pleading for any little amounts of money or valuable goods that the Hutterite colonies could give him for ransom to the slave masters. After this, he then set off on this extremely hazardous mission. He began this journey north with a complete trust in God, writing, "Sometimes my heart was so heavy, and time was so long that my eyes watered. How may I do it otherwise than resign myself to God, and take hold of the opportunities that my heart shows to me?" He continued also writing at this time, "I can say it with a clear conscience that I rather hurt my body in order to free some individuals." Unfortunately, there are no letters that inform us on what happened during Solomon's time in the Hajduk territories. Solomon did manage to return home safely, although we don't know if he was successful or not in returning imprisoned sisters. In December 1609, Solomon returned to the Brotherhood in Moravia after more than 2 years of being away. He gave a full report of his activities to the bishop of the Brotherhood, named Klaus Bradel. While we don't have any written records of Solomon during his time on the colonies, we do know that the Counter-Reformation was in full effect against the Protestants and the Hutterites. We also know that the growing tensions between the Catholics and the Protestants was foreshadowing the disastrous 30 Years' War which will start in 1618. Back home in his colony, Solomon again could not find any rest, nor could he forget all the sufferings of the sisters who were still imprisoned. Soon enough, Solomon began planning for his 5th journey into Turkey, accepting the fact that the Hutterian Brotherhood had no more funds to give him for his ransoms. Being resourceful, Solomon looked for alternative avenues to raise the ransom money. He decided to apply to a nobleman in Slovakia for aid. This nobleman went by the name of Colonel Siegfried. Colonel Siegfried was one of the most famous generals of his time. Colonel Siegfried also happened to be a staunch supporter of Martin Luther and did whatever he could to assist the Reformation. Colonel Siegfried's estate also housed a Hutterite colony in modern-day Slovakia, back then Upper Hungary, where the Hutterites enjoyed plenty of freedoms and prosperity. Solomon appealed to Colonel Siegfried for a Turkish prisoner, who Solomon could then exchange for Hutterite sisters. Colonel Siegfried accepted this and donated Solomon an able-bodied male Turk that Solomon claimed was worth 6 oxen. During this time, there were many signs of the political unrest, which will explode into the 30 Years' War very soon. Solomon wrote a letter to Colonel Siegfried before entering Turkey, which ends up being the last letter that he writes. Colonel Siegfried responded to Solomon in another letter, ordering Solomon to secretly warn the Hutterian Brotherhood of the evil plots of the Counter-Reformation. Robert Friedman writes, "At the end of February 1610, Solomon traveled with his Turk through Slovakia towards Hungary. No more was heard from him after this time." The original manuscript of Solomon's letters concludes with a postscript, and that now he, Solomon, will have found rest on behalf of his wife. They said in the congregation that the Turk had murdered him on the road, thus ransoming himself. Unfortunately, this is where our story ends. Robert Friedman, in his brief essay of Solomon's letters, does write that Solomon saved no more than 6 sisters and 2 brothers in the 32 months that he was in Turkey. These 8 Hutterites are but a small fraction of the 240 Hutterites that were dragged away in June of 1605. But Solomon can certainly rest easy, knowing that he did all that he could, and that saving 8 people's lives is still a huge victory. Unfortunately, none of these freed Hutterites included Solomon's wife or child, and Solomon never even got a trace of his wife or child's whereabouts during his travels. So what happened to the rest of the 232 captured Hutterites who Solomon couldn't save? Well, the Chronicle of the Hutterian Brethren writes, "Let us never forget those who were carried off into foreign parts, but continually remember them before God, and daily bemoan their sufferings." About 240 brothers, sisters, and children were taken from us as prisoners. About 90 were eventually released, some as late as 1614. But there are about 150 of whom we heard no more. We have never found out whether they are still alive or where they may be scattered. So of the original 240 Hutterites who were enslaved, Solomon found and freed 8 of them. This leaves 232 Hutterites left. Then, as the Chronicle stated, around 90 of them were all released by 1614. This leaves 142 Hutterites still enslaved and unaccounted for throughout the Ottoman Empire. So what happened to these 142 enslaved Hutterites? Where did they end up? Well, there's a Hutterian woman named Linda Meindel, and she runs a brilliant blog centered around her life and faith as a Hutterite, which I have linked to in the video description below, which I strongly recommend that you check out. In a post from 2014, Linda Meindel writes about how she was contacted by a man whose parents were both Turkish Cypriots, or Turks from Cyprus. However, after conducting DNA tests, this man discovered that some of his ancestors were in fact from Southern Tyrol, and that one of his ancestors had been an Anabaptist, and was among the 240 Hutterites who had been dragged off by the Turks on that fateful day in 1605. I'm only giving a brief summary of this article because I really want you to read Linda Meindel's article for yourself. But it appears that these captured Hutterites had been taken to Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul, and then were sold as slaves to farms in Cyprus. Thank you so much for watching this documentary. If you enjoy my work, please consider supporting my work on Patreon. By becoming a Patreon, I will respond to all of your questions through Patreon's direct messages. You will also get early access to all of my documentaries before they're released to the general public. But most importantly, You will be helping me produce higher quality and more frequent content in the future. Also, please make sure to sign up for my free mailing list so you do not miss any important updates. The link for this is in the video description below. I appreciate you for watching this video until the very end. Take care of yourself and always remember, you are beautiful and unique. Have a great rest of your day.